welcome everybody. This is going to be a crash course video on how to use Construct 2. Now, this is going to be the video that you need to understand the rest of the course. Now, when I'm building the games, the games will be done at a quicker pace the farther you go into the course. And the reason is I don't have to explain it time and time and again. The first 20 are explained in much greater detail than the last 40. Now, the reason, and this is done in course on purpose, is because once you get into a rhythm, it's a lot easier to understand what I'm doing. So if you jump to the end of the course and you think it's too fast, well, that's why. So that's something that I want to make sure that you know. The other thing I want to make sure that you know is how everything is working within Construct 2. So the first thing that we need to do is go to File, New here. Now you can add in all of these different projects here, and there's templates as well. There's all these examples. I highly recommend that you take a look at these whenever you can. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look, and what we're going to be mostly working with here is the standard definition 16 by 9 project. So the standard definition is how big it is, and how big a project is simply based on how many pixels there are. Now, pixels are little squares that make up your screen, and the more pixels, the more resolution. Right? So you can see here that we have a 16 by 9 project. We also have a 4 by 3 project. That is what is called the aspect ratio. That's the relation between the width and the height, or the height and the width, depending on which one you're looking at here. Okay, so you can go ahead and do all of these here. As a standard definition 3 by 4 projects work on a lot of devices here. The reason why we do standard definition is because when you work on mobile devices, it can actually be really difficult to run even simple games. So you're more than welcome to do that here. Now, you can also do HD projects as well, and we do make a few of those, and there are times where you need to do that, and I'll show you how and why you do that here. But for the most part, if you're making simple games, you want to start with the standard definition. And then if you're making something that works on like a computer or desktop, you can go to the HD here. Let's just go ahead and let's make a standard definition 16 by 9 project here. Now, one thing that you need to understand about Construct 2 is that there is this dotted line, if you can kind of see it in here, okay? And this dotted line, as you can see, is going to be what the player sees. So what I do is I copy the window size and paste it on the layout size, and that way that's just the entire screen. Now, the reason why we have that dotted line there is, so let's say you're making a platformer, something like a Mario game. Well, Mario can only see a certain part of the level, and that the rest of the rest of the space there is the rest of the level. So, but for the most part, we're making one page games here. That's something that you want to see here, and that's actually what I have been researching. Games that have a lot of downloads, like 1 million downloads, that have really simple art but really good gameplay, and there's actually a lot of them on the App Store. So I've been researching that for you, so I can show you how to make the best possible game with the least possible amount of work, and teach you some of the design secrets along the way here. Okay, so the number one thing that you need to do is double click, and you can just double click anywhere, by the way. So this is how we add in objects, and you can see that there's a ton of different kinds here. There's buttons, there's there's sprites, shadows, touch, media, there's browser objects. If you want to add in anything, you need to double click here, and that's anywhere. So let's just add in a sprite. And you can see that, if you don't see that, you can click this paint bucket here, and you can just give it a color here. We're not really interested. This is not a tutorial that's going to teach you very specifics. It's to teach you how Construct 2 works. So now we have a game here, and if I push run here, you can see that, well, we now run the game here. Now, what I did there was I pushed F5. You can run the layout, or you could run something called a debug layout, which will give you all of the stats here. And the reason why we use a debug layout is if something's not working, you can kind of see specific variables or specific numbers that might be that might be important. Now I'm going to talk about that later. The other thing that you need to understand is the input. So we have a gamepad input, a keyboard input, a mouse input, and a touch input. I highly recommend that you mostly use the touch. Okay, there's a reason for that is, and just double click it by the way to add it. The reason why you want to use the touch is that touch works both on, let's say, an iPhone and a computer. They work both on the same. They work both on those two devices. There's no mouse on an iPhone, so if you make a game using the mouse, it won't work on your iPhone or your iPad or any other mobile device for that matter. But you can do that. You can go and add that in here. So what we're going to do is we have this event sheet here. And this is where we add in all of our items here. So we have an event, okay? And we can double click here and we can add in a sprite. We can add in a touch here. Or we can add in a system object here, but we have to have an event here. So for example, we could say a touch, and we can do on any touch start. So if we touch the screen here, we can do something. So this is the way Construct 2 works. We add an event, and then that event does something. Okay, and this is really the fundamental thing that you need to understand about games, and then you can use this anywhere, whether it's Unity or Unreal or whatever. You have an event, and then you do something with that event. Okay, so we can do a whole bunch of things here. Watch this. We can click on the sprite, we can rotate it, you can set animations, set the appearance, which is kind of like how it looks. We can add instance variables, which we'll talk about in a short second here. And you can also do all these other items here. But what we're going to do is we're just going to destroy it. Okay, that's a simple one here. And if I click it, well, you can see it gets destroyed. That actually works out pretty well. Now, as you can see here, that is simply the way it works. Okay, so we have touch and we have sprite, and you get to destroy it there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about more items in Construct 2 in the next tutorial. Alright, so now we have done something really simple. And by the way, if I double click and you see this window here, that means that I have double clicked anywhere. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can go and add in something called a variable. So let's right click and we can add in a global variable. Now variables are used to store data, and data is really important. Now, when you think about computer games, you want to think about data as and variables as something that you need to keep track of and you need to constantly keep setting. So for example, when you make a computer game, you are telling the computer to literally do everything, right? You start off with something blank and you literally tell it to do everything. So if I were to use the example, if you told someone to go to the store, buy some apples, and come back, you'd have to program every step. And along the way, you would have to add in some variables. And these variables will keep track of what you're doing. So, for example, a good variable, for example, in that example of going to the store, buying apples, and coming back home. Okay? So, for example, you might have a variable that says, is going to the store, true or false. So while you're going to the store, the variable is going to the store is set to true. Once you're at the store, you have to pick up apples. You might have a variable that says has apples, and you can either set that to true or false. And once you have the apples, you can set the variable come back home to true. Right? So you can see that we have all that there. We can also, if we wanted to, if you said pick up 9 apples, you could have a variable that could keep track of how many apples you pick up. Okay? So if this doesn't make sense, it will make sense at the end of the game here and the end of the course. So oftentimes you have something like is alive. This is a variable, and this is a very specific kind of variable. It's a game state variable. And in Construct 2, there are no true or false what we call Boolean variables, so we use 0 and 1, 0 being false, 1 being true. So for example, you usually set is alive to 1. So when you start the game, think of like Mario or something like that, you would go and you would be playing your game, and if you hit a Goomba or fall in a pit, you set is alive to 0. Okay, and then if I double click and say compare variable, okay, and if I says is alive is, and you can see that is not equal, is less than, greater than, etc. We're going to say if is alive is equal to 0, then we, for example, play the game over music and restart the level, okay? And that's something that you really need to understand as time goes on, is you add a ton of global variables to keep track of a lot of gameplay items. And in this one here, it's a game state variable. Now, you can add in specific, for example, let's say you had a couple of these orange squares and you wanted to give them health, right? Well, this is what we call an instance variable, and that instance variable is set just for that specific object here. So let's say you have 10 enemies on screen. You can't use a global variable for health. Each one of those items on screen has to have an instance variable, all right? And they have to have their own health. So if you type in health and you give it a number of 10, well, then it has 10 health before it, can get destroyed, all right? So instance variables works just for a specific object, and a global variable works, well, for the entire project here, okay? So that's essentially what global variables and instance variables are. Now, there's a few other things you need to understand about construct 2. You see that there's the name of this here, okay? You always want to name it as orange block. You always, always, always want to name your items and everything to be something that makes sense, right? You can see in the Objects tab here, if you push F2, okay, and that's something that's really important. And I don't always tell people that I do that in the course, but if you want to change your object here, the name here, you push F2, okay, and then you can go and change it to whatever you want. For example, if you want to change this to game layout, and then you can change this to game sheet. Now, the other thing is you can see at the bottom here, if I push F2, you can see that it's at the bottom here. So if you see me do something, and you can always just check back to that here. There's left click, and that's supposed to help you out here. Now, the other thing is that you can add in layers, and the way that layers work is that they have imagine sheets of paper here. So you have one sheet of paper on top of another, and the reason why you do this is, let's say you have a background as one layer, so you can always call this the background layer. And let's say the background was a picture of mountains or something, and then you'd have like your game here, and I usually call it the player layer, and that's where all the players interact. So imagine there's a mountain background, and then use the Mario example, there's a bunch of blocks and Goombas and coins and mushrooms, etc. That would be on the player layer. And if you want to, let's say, keep the score, you could add that on the heads-up display layer, or HUD for short. That's a good acronym there. So you'd see that there's different layers here. You can also lock the layers, and I usually lock the background layer just because you don't want to move around the background. Okay, so for the most part, that's pretty much it when it comes to layers of the project and everything that we do here. Now, as we go along here, I will show you how to do very specific things in Construct 2, but that's essentially the gist of it. You need to understand that these two videos of Crash Course, you want to make sure that you understand that, and as you go along, things will make more and more sense. All right, this concludes the tutorial.